I'm Heidi Waterhouse, and I realize I am the only thing standing between you and beer, so I'll make this as fast as possible. I mean, priorities, right? So this talk is called Fear of the Bus, and it's about documentation and DevOps and what we can do to make documentation a little more useful for people who don't have a documentation team because they're working on internal stuff. Come on. Oh, clicker, why you gotta be like that? The title of this talk is derived from a black humor joke about whether your company would survive if someone got run over by a bus. Some people prefer the winning the lottery scenario or the kidnapped by aliens, but it all comes down to, is there someone with such essential knowledge that your company will be unsustainable without it? Because it turns out that no matter how reliable somebody is, there's always going to be something that keeps them from coming in. Their kid gets pneumonia or chicken pox, or a bridge falls into the river, or it randomly snows sideways 16 inches. I'm not bitter at all about April. But we need to be able to continue our operations even without that key person there. Most operations and DevOps people are running flat out just to keep up with what's going on. And if you ask them to do any extra work like documentation, they will give you this look like, yeah, no, because they're trying to keep up with what's happening. So whatever solution we come up with is going to have to be almost seamless for them, like almost frictionless. Because it turns out that the thing that is problematic about humans and documentation is that knowing stuff is like the RAM of the mind. As soon as you reboot, you lose all the pointers. And this is really true about humans, operations, and wikis. Because it may exist in documentation somewhere, but if the one human who knows how to find it is not available, it's as if it did not exist. So even if something is written down, if you can't find it, you don't have it. The thing that makes this all work, the way to insulate ourselves, is to make sure that no one is irreplaceable. When you go across a suspension bridge, it's not that one cable is holding you up, it's that a large number of cables are holding you up, and even if one of them breaks, you probably still aren't going to plummet to your death. We need to make our organizations that resilient. So here are my core principles of documentation. Everyone can touch the docs. That means there's no sacred priesthood of documentation that you have to have the special $2,000 FrameMaker license to make documentation. That's no good. You can do that for like user-facing documents if you want, but it's no good for internal documentation. Remember that content matters more than presentation. I don't care how ugly it is as long as you get it out there. And a lot of people hang up on this, especially in operations. I think it's some kind of like weird transmissible LaTeX problem where they're like, what if I could format that perfectly? And I'm like, no, don't format it perfectly, just write it. And the last thing you need to be aware of as a core principle is that documentation reduces burnout because that key person is not getting pinged all the time for information. So when I think about this, the thing I like to say is that wrong data is worse than missing data. Doing the wrong thing is more catastrophic than doing nothing. Missing data is way worse than ugly data. I don't care how homely and hot dog stand your documentation is if somebody can get their job done with it. And ugly data saves lives. And if you ever think that the stuff you're doing does not have an effect on the real world, think again. Because at some point, our software intersects with humans and can, in fact, cause them actual physical problems. There are three categories of DevOps information. It's automatable, or it's structural, or it's secret. Those are the only things we need to keep. Everything else is sort of fluff that we're hanging on to because we have a lot of feelings about throwing things away. So when you're looking at your data, can you sort it into these bins, or can you sort it into the other bin and get rid of it? Because all the data that you don't need is hiding all the data you do need. If you could make your straw stack smaller to find your needle in, that would be useful. So automatable stuff is anything that you could do with a script, because we should all be working to reduce what Liz Fong-Jones calls toil. That's repeated, tedious work. Because I want you to be doing something interesting with your life. I don't want you to be running the same server things. I don't want you to be, oh my gosh, I had a job a million years ago, obviously, that involved reinstalling SQL 7 like twice a day from scratch. And I didn't have the skills to automate it. I just had to like wipe out my test computer and reinstall SQL 7 and try and get the ODCB connections to work correctly. It was hell. I got really fast at it though. I bet you didn't know that it was possible to take it from like nothing, bare metal, to fully deployed in under 2 hours. I'm that good, or that practiced. So if you can automate something, do it. If you're putting together a server, just script it instead of writing instructions about how to do it. Because nobody wants to run the instructions, they just want the server. It's not exciting to run the instructions. Automation is a lot like teaching your children a chore. The first few times your kids do a chore, it's maddening, because they do it worse than you do. You have to nag them through the whole thing, and in the end, you didn't get anywhere. It would have been much better, faster, and more efficient to do it yourself. But as time goes on, it turns out that they can, in fact, be taught how, dishwashers work and garbage cans. Still working on the washing machine, but, there's time. So automating your processes is like that. Like at first, it seems really long and tedious, but as time goes on, your incremental advantage increases. The second kind of information is structural. This is the way that we describe how things are. And I like to think of this as things that we need to have in a predictable way all the time. So for example, when we fill out a bug in a bug tracking system, it's much easier to check all of the required forms or required fields than it is to write a long form paragraph about what happened with this bug and remember every single thing that you have to include. So if you are doing some kind of cataloging of data, make it a template so that you don't have to think about it and so that people don't forget parts of it. A little known secret of template use is that you need to store a copy of the template somewhere where no one else can get to it, because no matter how many times you tell people to make a copy, they will overwrite the original, and you will have that feeling of infinite frustration. Structural information is where we keep information about workflow. What is the series of steps that need to happen for something to be released? Have you made that into a punch list? If you need to terminate an employee, how many steps are there? Because if you miss one of those steps, like say locking them out of the data center, it could have really negative consequences. So human processes are something that we need to document internally and keep track of and keep updated. Otherwise, we're going to miss steps because we're just human. Secret information is the hardest kind of thing to document because you have to do threat modeling on it. If you're in an organization that does maturity models of security and has standing security policies, you don't have to worry about this because somebody has already told you what to do with that kind of information. But if you're not in that kind of group, if you're in a smaller organization, you're going to have to do it yourself. So how do you do threat modeling quick and dirty? Ask yourself, what will happen if you no longer have access to the data? How bad is that? What will happen if the data is found by good actors, like people inside your company? What will happen if data is found by bad actors, like hackers? Once you have the answers to that, you know how secure you need to keep something. It's the kind of information we're most likely to skip documenting because it seems risky to have it written down. But it's also the most important to have outside of a single person's brain. For example, what happens if you don't have a way to access your current website because the host username and password was set up by a contractor who's no longer affiliated with the company? Now what if it's the password to your Microsoft MSDN account? We don't have those anymore, but you don't always want to publish this information on an open internal wiki, but you do have to figure out where to keep it so that the right people can find it when they need it. So no matter what type of information you're documenting, it has to have these three elements. It has to be findable, it has to be usable, and it has to be current. Happily, because we're talking about the DevOps world, we don't have to worry about any of these things. It doesn't need to be pretty or fancy or friendly. We're going to skip those. I think they're important for making users comfortable, but this is just us folks, right? When you're trying to collect information to document, it doesn't just mean telling people they should write down what they're doing. It means making it easy to write things down, almost easier than not writing them. It means removing all of the obstacles and giving people an easy way to do the right thing. It's a cultural change. The first thing you have to do is figure out what you have and where it is. Officially, this is called a documentation audit. Some people just call it like staring into Confluence and weeping, but it's a little less professional. But you need to look at and make a spreadsheet of or a mind map of what you already have and how old it is. And then you can see the gaps where you don't have things by the shape of what you do have. And then you can throw a bunch of that stuff away because it's old and therefore useless. If you can, install some internal analytics. What pages are people using most? You want to be sure to address the content on those first. And I always find it astonishing, the things that I find when I do this. Like, I did a contract for Pluralsight on their author side website, and I put in analytics, and I said, what page do authors care most about? My money was on how to set up a microphone for recording, or the software, or something like that. No, #1 hit by like 15 or 20%, how to do title case capitalization, which was required for I know. It's like, why is that the thing but it's the thing nobody knows. Like, unless you're a professional writer, you do not inherently know whether you capitalize the or not in the middle of a sentence that's a title. So that was the thing people were looking for, but it was way down in the list of things. So I just popped it up to the top, and I reduced the dwell time on page pretty significantly because people weren't like rummaging through the page trying to find it. I'm like, I would never have guessed that. That's why you have to have analytics, because you are not them. And collecting information doesn't have to be about writing a lot of new information. It means getting people to share their personal hidden folders, their desktop documents, and sometimes their Post-it notes. You know that Post-it note that somebody has stuck to their monitor that has like the crucial information for their job? What happens if there's like a flood or a fire or like a really enthusiastic cleaning crew? We might be doomed as a company. So collect that together and put it someplace that everybody can find it, or everybody relevant. You're going to start the documentation audit by listing all of your current documents in a spreadsheet. Doesn't have to be fancy. Make columns for the tasks that you expect your DevOps teams to be able to support, like deploy to production or respond to AWS outage. And then decide what kind of documents that you need for those tasks. I suggest these, like, what kind of document do you need? You need a punch list. What do we do when this thing is happening? I am panicking. I am sleepy. The pager went off. What do I do next? Who is responsible? Like, there's nothing more frustrating than reading an article or a wiki or something, and it says, talk to Joe, and Joe hasn't worked at the company in 4 years, and you don't know who replaced Joe or if that knowledge is just gone forever. What's the workflow, which is a little like the punch list, but like, how do you get something all the way through approval? What is everything you need to do for a release? Support information. Who do you call when your servers are making the grindy noise? Like, there's probably a company or a person or somebody, but you need that documented, and you'd rather not wake up like the one person who is paying that. And then dependencies, like, for the love of God, don't reboot this until you turn this other thing off, because if you do it in the wrong order, neither of them will come back up correctly. That happens. It doesn't do you any good to collect information if no one can find it. You're going to need to use a little structure, a little metadata, and some internal training to make sure that people can actually find the stuff that you gathered together. But this doesn't have to be super elaborate. One of my favorite recommendations for internal documentation is to throw your wiki in the garbage and put everything in a giant flat file, one long scrolling file. This sounds horrifying, like in a like information architecture sense, but it means that there is one place, one canonical place that we can look for that information that we need. Like, this is the future. We have search. We can search a 20,000 word page. Doesn't actually take that long if it's all in one place. So what you do is you just add new things to the top with hopefully relatively useful headings, and they push down less relevant things. It seems really weird, but as you use it, it actually kind of works pretty well. Thank you. I would not like to take a call right now. So what's this called? Blue screen of death. Okay, so when I said you need to be able to search it, you need to be able to search it using what users call it. Until 2014, you could not search the Microsoft support site for the phrase blue screen of death. That's not what they call it. And so therefore they didn't put it in their index. They never aliased it to all of the answers that they have about internal server faults. And you couldn't search for it on the site where you were most likely to be able to get some help with it. I assure you there is something like that in your organization where you call it one thing and the users call it another. And this is where your analytics are going to come in handy again, because you're going to be able to see what it is people are searching for and not finding. So we just had this great talk about USDS. Their sister organization is 18F, and they have set up the most cunning Slack bot I have ever heard of. This guy named Mike Bland did it. Every time someone says something in the Slack that they think should be documented, they can put a React that they don't use for anything else right after it, and it opens a GitHub issue with that phrase so that people know they need to get that documented. I'm like, what? That's amazing. I'll distribute the slides after this, and I have Mike's GitHub stuff in there so you can find it. Every team has their own idiosyncratic ways of communicating. That's not going to work if you don't have a very slacky team. 18F is very distributed, so that works out pretty well for them. But I just love the idea of like, hey, we should document this. Oh, automatically we have a task to do so. Testing is for everyone. All of the hardest problems in computers are people. And people need to have breaks, otherwise they burn out. So when I say testing, I mean, how do you test that going off rotation, going off duty is actually going to work effectively? The only way you can really do that is make someone go off duty. Take away their pager and their work phone, turn off their access to Slack, and tell them they have an actual day off. Do it when you're not under a ton of stress, you're not trying to do anything magical or important, and see what breaks, because something's going to break. And then you know what you have to fix. It's like Chaos Monkey, but for people. And also, they come back a lot happier. If you handle a set of stressful actions when the world is not actually on fire, and when people aren't actually emotionally compromised, it makes it easier to do the same good practice when they are emotionally compromised. Because I tell you what, if anybody calls their coworker while they are in the hospital having a baby, I will come and find you and do something terrible to your toenails, because I know at least 3 women that happened to. I know a lot of women in IT, and they're like, oh, hey, I know that you're like currently in labor, but could you like tell us what the... No, not a thing. I want you to remember that DevOps docs save time and money and having to post pictures of the Hindenburg where your uptime statistics used to be. because documenting things helps you avoid disasters. So if this was too long and you read Twitter instead, write it down because that's safer and easier than remembering it. And if you'd like a free t-shirt and you haven't gotten one from our booth yet, you can take a picture of this slide and go to the URL, and we will send you one. Thank you very much for your attention. Beer.